Hello and welcome. How truly fair is globalization? How much do the poorer developing nations really see any improvement in their lives as a result of a concept that is touted as good by developed nations? A new film featuring Hollywood star Danny Glover, with whom we'll be speaking shortly, aims to shed light on some of the primary issues facing countries such as those in Africa due to globalization. The downside includes growing debt, greater inequality, and an increased disparity between the incomes of the rich and poor. Bamako tells the story of a mock trial in the capital city of Mali, which provides the name of the movie. The World Bank and International Monetary Fund are accused of being at the heart of Africa's woes. The fictional story is an interwoven tale with documentary elements to remind viewers that beyond the headlines, there are real people affected day in, day out. Don't forget, we take your questions and comments on this subject, and you can reach us at the numbers at the bottom of your screen. Well, joining me to discuss Bamako and the issues the movie raises are award-winning actor and humanitarian activist Danny Glover, who co-produced and acted in the film. He also serves as a Goodwill Ambassador for the United Nations Development Programme, focusing on issues of poverty, disease and economic underdevelopment in Africa, Latin America and the Caribbean. He's joining us from San Francisco in California. And in New York, the co-executive producer of the film, JOSLYN, who has lived and travelled widely in Africa and Asia. Both Mr. Glover and Ms. Barnes co-founded L'Ouverture Films, which is dedicated to the development and production of films of historical relevance, social purpose, commercial value and artistic integrity. Good to have you all with us here.
Thank you.
Good to be here. Thank you.
Danny Glover, if I can start with you and ask you first, what made you get involved in particular with this movie or this particular subject in the first place?
Well, one of the things that you pointed out at the top of the show was, in your introduction, was the fact that globalization affects real people. The debt the debt crisis for countries in the global south affect real people. We don't often hear their stories. When I met Adura Mensah-Sako, I had also known his work from other films like Waiting for Happiness. And when he threw out the concept, and both JOSLYN and I embraced the concept of putting the World Bank on trial, we were available to help him proceed with his idea and his vision. And I think it's one of the things that we've tried to do in our company, in our short-lived period that we've been here, is to to support African filmmakers and to support filmmakers from the diaspora. So all the work that I had been doing with UNDP and UNICEF, the reason why I came to UNDP was I wanted to be a part and hear the dialogue, the discourse about development, and how can we talk about alternative models? What are the real issues? Right. Certainly, Bamako gives us an insight into the impact that it has on the lives of those people who are victimized, displaced, those people who live in that no man's land of being voiceless and unheard of as we deal with the crisis. Yes, you can talk about GDP rising in certain countries, and we've seen those numbers. Yes, you can talk about the idea that this country now has an A+ credit rating. Yes, you can talk about all those things, but at the same time, we find in countries like Ghana and Kenya and Guinea-Conakry, with actually 30% of the kids who are actually eligible to go to school, we find that the service departments in terms of health care have been dismantled, essentially, or privatized. And when we talk about the debt, what do we mean by the debt? What are we talking about the debt? Do we talk about the debt in reference to privatization? Right. Do we talk about the debt in terms of the currency fluctuations? We talk about the debt in terms of the things that need to be talked about. We talk about it from a framework of being forgiven, and et cetera, et cetera. Right. We believe, as those people who are victimized, that the debt should be abolished.
We'll talk with some of those details in a moment as well, Danny, but let me get the co-executive producer, JOSLYN Barnes, in from New York and ask, I mean, is it really the World Bank and IMF who are on trial in Bamako, or is it the Western, certainly the developed nations?
Well, I think specifically the bank and the fund are targeted in the film for discussion, and I think that that's reasonable because when you look at the bank, which is called the World Bank, it services the G8 countries. It's not really a World Bank. That is one of the myths that the film takes apart. I mean, the bank operates as a corporation and its shareholders are the group of 8 industrialized countries. But I don't think it's the entire West that's on trial. I think what's on trial here is an economic framework. And certainly the film, if you notice, doesn't come to, there's no verdict per se in the trial. The verdict is implicit. What the point of the film really is, and what the point of the trial really is to say, look, these decisions are being made in Washington and in capitals in the West, but they're affecting billions and billions of people across the world without any reference to the impact of on people in their day-to-day lives. And that's really the point of the trial.
Well, JOSLYN, also the way the movie is done is that there are fairly long diatribes by the people giving evidence at this trial, and then it's interwoven with the story of a couple, for example, and some of the characters. But I wonder, when you make a film like this, which is almost like a court testimony, who do you see as the intended audience?
Well, I think the intended audience is first and foremost Africans, because it is Africans speaking for themselves in the film. But I think it's also, the intended audience is global. I mean, this is a global issue. This is not specific only to Africa. The impact of these policies we see across the whole developed world. And certainly people in the North whose governments are pushing for these policies need to be aware of what the effect is on the ground of these policies. The bank and the fund are acting as debt collectors for commercial lending institutions. So when we see, you know, people, very prominent people, rock stars and politicians and others, getting behind the idea of debt relief, we have to take that apart and really hold our own governments accountable and say, are you really providing debt relief? Or are you actually really just restructuring the debt? Because the assessment they make for countries when they structure the debt, they don't look at how poor a country is. They look at their capacity to pay. So if you have a country like Botswana, which has one of the highest GDPs on the continent, the life expectancy of people in Botswana is about 37 years of age. This is an incredible disparity, and what it points to is privatization. It points to a lack of sovereignty on the part of the government. I'm
going to get in a call. We've got Baghdad on the line. Good to hear from Iraq with a live phone call. Tamer, what would you like to ask?
My question is, while we all know what the World Bank is and what it does, where is the responsibility of these African leaders who are taking the money and stealing it from their people?
Danny Glover, if I can put that to you. Our caller from Baghdad asked that question.
Well, that's another myth, you know, as well. You know, some of this money goes into certainly projects that are unnecessary, and certainly there's been a legacy of leaders who've skimmed off, and this corruption. But you know, corruption happens in many places, even in the West as well. But when we look at the idea of how the pricing, how often construction is priced, and how spare parts are priced, and how Africa is priced for its finished goods, we find a large disparity between that and what happens in other situations. So I think it's easy to talk about corruption on the one hand, but I think corruption is not the only element in terms of this. We find that people in the world, not just Africa, that people in the world, and you look at UNDP statistics, United Nations statistics, people in the world becoming poorer and poorer. Real consumption has declined in Africa for more than 30 years, and that is simply not the result of corruption that's happening in those countries. So I think it's easy for us to kind of attach ourselves to the idea of corruption without looking at all the kind of factors around what actually happened. It takes, so for someone to be corrupt, it takes another party on the other side to corrupt them as well.
JOSLYN, before I get your comment in there, let's take a look at a clip from the movie so we can actually show a part of Bamako for our audience, where it looks at the subject of dictates that are imposed by the World Bank and IMF on those countries, which has been touched on in our debate here.
Mais cet argent est injecté en contrepartie. C'est pour forcer la main aux 18 pays afin qu'il aille plus vite dans la mise en œuvre de réformes structurelles qui profitent au Nord. Mais même, je ne me bats pas seulement pour les subventions, je me bats pour la possibilité, la latitude pour un pays comme le Mali de faire du coton si c'est cela qui l'arrange, de ne pas en faire, mais de pouvoir vivre.
Well, the woman there is saying, of course, that the World Bank and IMF says dictates what those countries should do with their money, how they should use it. JOSLYN, I wanted to get your comment on what Danny was saying, based on the caller we had from Baghdad, and also the idea that is it fair to think that the bank would automatically ask a country to do something that goes against its national interests?
Well, to go to the first question on corruption, I fully support what Mr. Glover said, and I also think that it's important to point out that it's in countries that have the least disparity of wealth that you find the least corruption. And that's because an informed and educated public can hold leaders accountable. And it's also because people actually then feel that they have a stake in their future. One of the things that this film very clearly illustrates is what happens to people when that future is taken from them. What happens to them imaginatively, what happens to them mentally, psychologically, physically. It's a very important point that one of the characters in the film actually commits suicide and is depressed and his relationship falls apart. We forget sometimes the effect these kind of things have on people's day-to-day lives. And corruption is certainly a major issue across Africa, across the United States, across many parts of the world. And as Danny said, you know, corruption works in two directions. There's someone accepting a bribe, there's also someone offering a bribe. And let's please remember that a lot of leaders in Africa were installed during the Cold War as puppets of certain regimes, including our own.
Let's get a call on from London. Richard's on the line. Richard, what would you like to ask?
Well, firstly, I'd like to just say how pleased as an Afro-Caribbean person, somebody that was born in the West, how pleased I am to see a black figure like Danny Glover stand up and represent the black race. I mean, from my perspective, I feel that, you know, a lot of the things that are happening in Africa are a knock-on effect of what the West has done through colonialism, through actually taking the human resource and distributing it around the world. And I think the World Bank has a responsibility to right a wrong that has been done. I think that it's a moral level. It's not about black, it's not about white. It's really about us all taking responsibility for what we did to Africa, Richard, and making sure that it too has a chance in the world economy.
Thank you, Richard, for that comment. As we get a response from our panel here, let's get another clip of the movie, and so viewers have a chance to get a taste of it here. And it's the one where there's basically a clip where a woman is testifying on what she believes to be the motives of multinational corporations, which is partly what you're referring to.
Qui n'a pas sa communication, qui n'a pas son énergie, qui n'a pas son transport, difficilement peut s'appeler un pays souverain. Et ce sont justement ces domaines que les multinationales veulent nous retirer. C'est ça. C'est pourquoi il ne faut pas qu'on se laisse faire. C'est difficile, mais je suis plus optimiste que l'enfer.
Well, this woman here was talking about how you know, countries can't really develop their own telecom systems and so on because multinationals come in and they basically take over, and that countries aren't given the chance to improve that way. And I wonder, Danny Glover, if you know, listening to what Richard had to say from London about African countries taking responsibility for themselves. Interesting point made in the movie in another clip, which we won't have a chance to see, but is a woman getting up there and saying that Africa's problem is not poverty, but its richness.
Well, I think so to a certain degree. Certainly, we would want to have countries be able to decide what happens in their own domain, what happens in their national borders, that they have to have control over there. They have to have control over to induce business and growth internally. That growth internally cannot come from the outside, specifically with outside investment. And I think that's the kind of fallacy and certainly the image that's presented by this whole thing of globalization. It's also the reason why we see the collapse in local families, local traditions, and local control over their own resources and over their own lives. And essentially, when you talk about nationalism and you talk about sovereignty, those are the kind of things that are essential to any kind of development. A sense of expectation from not only yourself as a citizen, but also governance as well. Right. And we see the collapse of that as we see the privatization of certain key industries, the privatization of water, with electricity, the privatization of the airport, of the other industries, the common space. We see that happening around the developing world. And I think what has happened as a result of that, it has provided another key installment in this whole process where capital expands itself. Global capital expands itself across everywhere. In fact, the example of this, I was in a community here in California, a community where a Swedish company, a German company had bought up the water facility, and the water that in that community was 100% 10% higher than the water from the other community next to it. So this reality is not just here, but it's around the world as well.
Let's get a quick comment in from JOSLYN Barnes as well then on where L'Ouverture Films will continue this kind of idea, this kind of project of, social debate.
Well, I think that our company is certainly dedicated to partnering with filmmakers from around the world, and especially in the developing South. I think we're looking at 5 more films that are specific to Africa with African filmmakers and producers. Some of them have a very particular agenda. Some of them just tell a great story. Hopefully they all just tell a great story.
Well, JOSLYN Barnes, I want to thank you and Danny Glover very much for joining us. The film is Bamako. You'll get a chance to see it very soon.
Thank you
so much.
Thank you both.
All right.
And thank you for being with us. And on the next show, we discuss the threat of terror and the climate of fear it creates with former New York City Police Chief Bernard Kerik. Many critics accuse the US of overestimating the threat to push its agenda forward both domestically and internationally. Don't forget, we want your thoughts and questions on that. Send the emails to riz@aljazeera.net. We'll see you next time. Now, Street Talk is coming up.